the most consanguineous pastor of Western Virginia, forced 3 nieces to marry him in his church. In the isolated mountains of the Appalachians, in McDowell County, Western Virginia, there is a story as disturbing as revealing about the dangers of extreme isolation and the consanguineous practices that marks generations of a family. This is the story of Ezekiel Thornton, a man who self-proclaimed pastor and, under the veil of religion, perpetuated one of the most shocking cases of documented consanguine union during the 1950s. Thornton case remained hidden for decades, protected by geographical isolation and the code of silence that hovered over the small rural communities of Western Virginia in the post-war period. It was not until 1978, when local authorities finally intervened after complaints from worried neighbors, that the true extension of this family plot began to surface. Ezekiel Thornton was born in 1911 in a small rural property away from Welch, the largest city in McDowell County. Son of miners, he grew up in a community already marked by isolation and marriages between cousins, something relatively common in those remote mountains. Historical records show that their own parents, Isaac and Martha Thornton, were second-degree cousins, a practice that, although questionable, was not uncommon in isolated regions of Appalachians during the early 20th century. At 19, after a brief period working in the coal mines that dominated the local economy, Ezekiel claimed to have received a divine call during a high fever caused by pneumonia contracted in the depths of the mines. This episode, according to reports from older members of the community interviewed years later, marked a radical change in his personality. The young miner, previously quiet and reserved, emerged from his illness with an unusual religious fervor and the conviction that he had been chosen to found his own church. The Church of Purified Redemption, as Ezekiel baptized it, was established in 1935 in a small wooden cabin built in Thornton family lands. Initially, the congregation consisted only of nearby family members and some curious neighbors. What few realized, however, was how Ezekiel gradually began to shape his religious interpretation to justify practices that would serve his own interests. He talked about blood purification and preserving the chosen lineage, Thomas Jenkins reported. One of the few members of the community who attended Thornton's first sermons before they walked away, alarmed with the direction they took. He said that God showed him that families should remain united, not only in spirit, but also in flesh, to preserve what he called divine gift granted to his lineage. The 1940s and 1950s were marked by the growing isolation of Thornton's property. Ezekiel built a high fence around his land and discouraged contact with outsiders. It was during this period that he took full control over the lives of his 3 nieces, daughters of his younger sister, Rebecca, who died in 1947 after complications in the delivery of his 4th daughter, who did not survive either. The girls, Mary born in 1932, Sarah 1934, and Ruth 1936, were created under the strict protection of her uncle, completely isolated from the outside world. Ezekiel assumed the role of father, teacher, and pastor, controlling all aspects of his lives. County school records show that none of the 3 attended the local school after his mother's death, with Ezekiel claiming to the rare authorities visiting the property that was providing scripture-based education at home. True horror began to unfold when Mary turned 18 in 1950. During a ceremony that Ezekiel described as divine, union ordered by the Lord, he forced his oldest niece to marry him. The ceremony was held at the small property church, with only family members present, all under the control and influence of the self-proclaimed pastor. Check it out if it is already subscribed to this channel. You value stories that reveal the darkest truths of American society and the devastating impacts of extreme isolation on rural communities. You need to sign up now. Our researched work brings to light cases that history tried to bury. 2 years later, in 1952, Ezekiel held a second ceremony, this time marrying with Sarah, then 18 years old. The pattern was repeated in 1954, when Ruth, the youngest, was also forced to join the uncle in a similar ceremony. What made the case even more disturbing was the fact that, officially, none of these marriages was recorded in the county authorities. Ezekiel kept what he called the Sacred Book of the Unions, where he documented his own ceremonies. Amelia Carton, a retired nurse who worked at Welch's small hospital during the 1950s and 1960s, was one of the first people outside the immediate circle to suspect that something was wrong. The girls appeared occasionally for medical care, always accompanied by Ezekiel, never alone, Carter reported in a statement to the authorities years later. They were extremely shy, avoided eye contact, and showed signs of malnutrition and possible abuse. But, at the time, it was very difficult to intervene in matters of isolated families. The consequences of these consanguineous unions did not take time to manifest. Between 1951 and 1978, 12 births resulting from these unions were documented. Of these, 5 children passed away before being 5 years old, presenting severe congenital malformations. Those who survived had a number of health and development problems that became more evident over the years. Dr. William Harrison, a geneticist who later studied the case to the Western Virginia Health Department, explained in his 1980 report, the descendants of this union had an extremely high consanguinity coefficient. We are not just talking about relatives marrying, we are talking about multiple generations of consanguineous marriages, culminating in the unions between uncle and nieces who already carried genes common of previous generations. Children who survived demonstrated a number of typical high consanguinity conditions: severe cognitive deficit, congenital heart problems, cast fingers syndactylium, asymmetrical face, and compromised immune system. James, the firstborn of the union with Mary, born in 1951, had a severe form of polydactyly, extra fingers in both hands and feet, as well as a serious intellectual deficit that prevented him from developing language and simple words even in adulthood. Life on Thornton's property followed a strict pattern established by Ezekiel. The 3 women and their children lived in precarious conditions, working on the small plantation that guaranteed the family's subsistence. The isolation was almost total. Children never attended schools, were never vaccinated, and rarely left the property. Ezekiel justified this isolation through his preaching, in which he claimed that the outside world was contaminated and that only his family had been chosen to preserve the purity of the lineage. He has established a rigid set of rules, including collective prayers 4 times a day and severe physical punishments for any questioning of his authority. The situation thus remained for almost 3 decades. protected by isolation and reluctance of local authorities to interfere with family affairs, a common attitude in the rural areas of Western Virginia at that time. It was not until 1978, when one of his children, Daniel, born in 1962, of the union with Sarah, managed to escape the property and seek help, that the case began to be investigated. Daniel, then 16, managed to reach the city of Welch after walking for almost 20 kilometers through the mountains. Despite its impaired development and communication difficulties, it was able to convey to the authorities sufficient details about the situation on La Thornton property to justify an investigation. Sheriff Robert Anderson, who led the first official visit to the property in October 1978, described the scene as something out of another century. The property was in deplorable conditions, with deteriorated structures and evident signs of extreme poverty. Children, many clearly presenting physical deformities, seemed scared and malnourished. Ezekiel, then 67, still maintained absolute control over all, through what I can only describe as a combination of religious and physical intimidation. The Thornton case presented a significant dilemma for local authorities. In 1978, there were no specific laws in Western Virginia to directly address the issue of consanguineous marriages within isolated religious contexts. In addition, there was the additional complication that none of the marriages had been officially registered, existing only in the ceremonies led by Ezekiel himself. However, evidence of child neglect, forced isolation, and inadequate living conditions was sufficient for the McDowell County Social Services Department to obtain a court order to remove children from the property. In total, 7 children aged 3 to 16 were removed from the site and placed under state care. The psychological impact on the 3 women, Mary, Sarah, and Ruth, was evident to the professionals who attended them after the intervention. Decades of isolation and indoctrination had created a deep conditioning that made it extremely difficult for them to conceive of a different life. Dr. Lena Montgomery, a psychologist who worked with the 3, documented in her report, "We observed a classic case of what we today call Stockholm Syndrome, combined with elements of extreme religious indoctrination. Patients show profoundly rooted emotional dependence on their captor, inability to recognize the abusive nature of the situation, and strong initial resistance to any external intervention." The 3 sisters initially resisted the separation of Ezekiel, a common reaction in victims of long periods of abuse and psychological manipulation. They genuinely believed that they were fulfilling some kind of divine destination, Dr. Montgomery explained. A long therapy process was needed to begin to recognize the abusive and exploiting nature of their situation. Detailed medical examinations performed on children revealed the true impact of extreme consanguinity. Dr. Robert Collins, a pediatrician who evaluated the 7 minors, documented, in addition to evident physical malformations, we observed a series of less visible but equally debilitating conditions: severe immunological deficiencies, heart problems, delay in neurological development, and predisposition to conditions such as epilepsy. In these children, the genetics behind the Thornton case became the object of scientific study in the following years. The consanguinity coefficient, a measure that indicates the probability of an individual inheriting identical genes of both parents in Thornton children, was exceptionally high. Dr. Harrison explained, even in cases of marriages between first-degree cousins, the consanguinity coefficient is approximately 6%. In Thornton children, we estimate values between 20% and 25%, considering not only the uncle-shaped relationship, but also the history of previous consanguinity in the family. This high degree of genetic kinship resulted in the expression of multiple deleterious recessive genes, mutations that would normally remain inactive when present in only one copy of the gene, but manifesting themselves when inherited from both parents. It's as if we were seeing the materialization of all the genetic burden accumulated by generations in this family, said Dr. Harrison. If you are following the story, I ask you to leave the phrase in the comments. True darkness lies in the isolation that allows these horrors to remain hidden. Your voice is important, so that cases like this are not forgotten and that we can continue to bring to light stories that society needs to know. Ezekiel Thornton's trial began in March 1979, attracting attention from regional media. Although the case was widely protected from national scrutiny due to sensitive nature and concerns about the privacy of the victims, Thornton, then 68, remained irreducible in his belief that he was fulfilling a divine mission. At a particularly disturbing moment during the trial, he stated, "What they call it wrong, I call sacred. What they call the disease, I call a mark of divine choice." Psychology experts who evaluated him diagnosed a combination of delusional disorder with narcissistic personality disorder elements. Dr. Kelvin Matthews, a forensic psychiatrist who examined Thornton, concluded the defendant developed an elaborate delusional system centered on distorted religious beliefs, which conveniently legitimized his desires and behaviors. There is no evidence that he does not understand the nature or consequences of his actions. He simply justifies them through his own belief system. The verdict arrived in June 1979. Ezekiel Thornton was considered guilty of multiple accusations, including child neglect, forced isolation, and exploration of vulnerable dependents. Although accusations related to consanguineous unions were complicated by the lack of official records, medical evidence and testimonies were enough to ensure a 25-year sentence. Thornton died in the state arrest in 1984 at the age of 73, never expressing remorse for his actions. For nieces and their children, the recovery path was long and complex. Mary, Sarah, and Ruth went through extensive psychological rehabilitation programs, initially housed together in a specialized installation for prolonged abuse victims. The three sisters gradually began to rebuild their identities and autonomy. Dr. Peter Lawrence, director of the rehab program, noted, "The challenge was not only to treat the trauma of abuse, but literally teach these women to live in the modern world. Things we made guaranteed, such as shopping, using phones, or even making independent decisions, were completely strange to them after decades of isolation and control." Ruously, the three began to show signs of recovery. Ruth, the youngest, adapted more easily and eventually managed to obtain basic education, ending the equivalent of elementary school in a special program at 47. Mary and Sarah, who had spent more time under Ezekiel's control, had more limited but still significant progress. For children, the challenges were even more complex. The health problems caused by extreme consanguinity required constant medical care. In addition, many of them had significant delays in cognitive development, requiring specialized educational programs. James, the eldest son, spent most of his adulthood at a specialized care institution, never developing full independence due to the severity of his cognitive deficits. Elizabeth, daughter of Ruth, born in 1972, was partially overcome her limitations, eventually completing high school in an adapted program and working in a protected environment. Daniel, whose escape enabled the intervention that ended Ezekiel's regime, became a symbol of resilience. Despite his learning difficulties and chronic health problems, he was able to adapt to life outside the Thornton property. At age 25, he gave a rare interview to a local newspaper, where he stated, "I don't always understand the world outside, but I know it's better than what we lived. Sometimes I still have nightmares about that place, with those voices saying we were special when we were actually being destroyed." The genetic impact of consanguinity continued to manifest in the following generations. The children who have managed to have their own children with unbleety partners still transmitted a committed genetic burden. Dr. Jessica Reynolds, a geneticist who accompanied the long-term case, explained, even after the interruption of consanguineous marriages, deleterious mutations remain in the family genetic pool. We observed a significantly higher incidence of conditions such as autoimmune diseases, cardiovascular problems, and certain types of cognitive deficits in descendants, even when intranguinity is no longer present. The Thornton case also had a significant impact on Western Virginia's public policies. In 1981, the state revised its children's protection laws, establishing more strict protocols for investigating isolated families and closed communities. Additionally, specific training programs were created for health professionals, education, and social services to identify signals of possible abuse in extreme isolation contexts. Sociologist Dr. Martin Reynolds, who has studied isolated communities in the Appalachians for 3 decades, noted, "The Thornton case is an extreme example, but is not completely isolated. The mountainous regions of Appalachia have historically housed communities with high levels of geographical and social insulation, creating conducive conditions for practices such as close relatives. Exceptional Thornton is the distorted religious control element and the extent of consanguinity over multiple generations." In fact, subsequent studies have identified several other isolated communities in the region with high rates of consanguineous marriages, although none at the end of the Thornton case. These studies have led to public health initiatives focused on these areas, including educational programs on the genetic risks of consanguinity and greater access to health services. The property of the Thornton, the stage of this dark history, remained abandoned for years after the intervention of the authorities. In 1992, it was finally demolished by order of the county, which declared it inappropriate for housing and a monument to a tragedy that the community would rather forget, in the words of the County Commissioner Howard Matthews. Where the Purified Redemption Church was previously lifted, a small woods were planted as a silent memorial to the victims. A discreet plaque, installed in 2005 at the initiative of some survivors and professionals who worked in the case, contains only the inscription, "In memory of those whose voices have been silenced." That their history teaches us vigilance against isolation that allows hidden suffering. The medical Psychological and genetic records of the Thornton case became important educational tools for health, social assistance, and law application. Medicine courses in regional universities often use this case as a study on the biological effects of extreme consanguinity. As social worker training programs analyze it as an example of the dangers of social and religious isolation. Mary Thornton passed away in 1998 at age 66 after heart complications, one of the common health problems in her family. Sarah lived until 2010, reaching 76 years, despite several chronic health problems. Ruth, the youngest of the sisters, was still alive in 2015, residing in an assisted community specializing in extended trauma survivors. Of the 7 children rescued in 1978, 4 had already died by 2015, all before they were 50. The 3 survivors continue to face various health challenges, requiring constant medical care. Daniel, whose courage had exposed the case, died in 2012 at age 50 due to congenital heart complications, a dark reminder of the genetic legacy he carried. Elizabeth, who had achieved the greatest degree of independence among her children, became a discreet defender of awareness of the dangers of consanguinity. Occasionally, he participated in lectures at medical schools and social assistance programs, sharing his experience. In one of these rare public appearances in 2008, he said, "I carry the marks of this story in my genes, my body, and my mind. Each day, it is a fight against the legacy that was imposed on me before I was born. I talk about it not because it is easy, but because silence allows stories like mine to continue to happen." Dr. William Harrison, who had studied the case from the genetic point of view, published in 2005 an extensive longitudinal study on the effects of consanguinity observed in the Thornton family. Their conclusions were alarming. The increase in homozygosity, the condition of having identical alleles in a genetic locus, resulted in an unprecedented expression of deleterious recessive characteristics. We observed not only evident physical malformations, but also dramatically increased susceptibility to various conditions, autoimmune diseases, metabolic failures, predisposition to certain types of cancer, and significant reduction in life expectancy. This genetic study has become a reference in the medical literature on consanguinity, cited in textbooks and scientific articles as one of the most extreme and well-documented cases of the biological effects of unions between close relatives along multiple generations. From the sociological point of view, the case also generated important reflections on how isolated communities can develop and normalize harmful practices. Dr. Angela Morrison, an anthropologist who has studied isolated rural communities, noted, "The Thornton case illustrates how extreme isolation combined with unqualified religious authority can create environments where clearly harmful practices are normalized. Lack of exposure to broader social norms and the absence of external verification mechanisms allowed this situation to persist for decades." The legacy of the Thornton case in the local culture is complex. On the one hand, there is an understandable reluctance to openly discuss such a disturbing episode. On the other hand, the case served as a catalyst for significant changes in the way isolated communities are monitored and how social services operate in the region. The Sheriff Anderson, who led the initial intervention, reflected years later, before the Thornton case. there was a widespread attitude of non-interference on how families lived, especially in remote areas. This case showed us that extreme isolation can hide terrible abuse, and that we have a collective responsibility to ensure the well-being of all community members, especially the most vulnerable today. The history of Thornton serves as a dark reminder of the dangers of extreme isolation, religious manipulation, and the devastating effects of prolonged consanguinity. It is also a testimony of human resilience, of the courage of a young man who, despite all the limitations imposed by his creation, found strength to seek help and thus end generations of abuse. If you watched so far, it is because you liked this story. Leave a comment saying, "I watched here," so I can meet you and know who really likes the stories here on the channel. If this report has touched you in any way, be sure to enjoy this video and share it. Stories like this need to be told so that we can learn from past mistakes and be vigilant against isolation that allows such horrors to remain hidden. Subscribe to the channel to learn more historical cases that reveal truths that society often prefers to ignore.